Just a couple of really quick thank yous before we kick off everything. So first of all, big thank you to Robert and to Trilogy for hosting us tonight in the lovely Republic building. It's a treat here. We've got a great view. And also to ING for making it possible. And also to my friend Christy, who is hiding behind there. And due to my incompetence, I can't actually make the slides work myself. So she's kindly agreed to flick for me. So big thank you to her as well. So my name's Nick Duxbury. I'm the chair of the IBP Futures Group. Basically, I'm aware a lot of you here may never have heard of the IBP. And it's basically the International Building Press. So it's an organisation that's just turned 50. And it's dedicated to kind of bringing together journalists and comms professionals around the built environment to kind of push better journalism, better communications. I got involved about 5 years ago when I was still a journalist, and that's when I sort of got City University involved as well. And tonight we're here to talk about brilliant features. So Christy, if you could... Brilliant. So I'd just like to introduce our fantastic speakers for tonight. So on the far left there, we've got Matt Reynolds, who's the science editor at Wired magazine. Next to Matt, we've got Emma Jacobs, features writer at the FT. And here on my right, we've got Martin Fletcher, freelance features writer who's written for nearly everyone and everyone. So thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you all here for coming here and giving up your time to speak. No one here is paid to be here. It's all goodwill, so thank you very, very much. We're running a little behind time. I've got a lot of questions to ask, but this is basically your event and your evening. So Christy's second job is to wave at me if I'm getting indulgent, so we make time for you guys to ask all the questions. On we go. Right, so we're going to kick off by talking to Matt. So Matt, just could you just give us a 1 minute sort of take on how you basically got to where you've got to today as science editor of Wire?
Cool. So super quick biography, which is good because I've only been doing this for like 4 years or something, so it is actually quick. I did an internship at Wired in 2016. I was doing management consultancy before then. Super boring. You've all made a good choice. So did an internship at Wired. After that, I was a staff writer at New Scientist for a year. And then from then, I came back to Wired. I was a staff writer there for a year. And then their current science editor moved on. I became science editor. So promised you it'd be quick.
Lightning, that's brilliant. So first up, what I'd like to know is what makes a great Wired feature, and specifically what makes a great sort of science feature on Wired.
Yeah, so it's interesting because Wired is a science and technology magazine, but I think we have quite a generous idea of that. I mean, basically, it's anything that's about the future. It's about things that are changing. It's about how the how the world is going to be different in whatever 50 years, or how people are making it different now. So I think the thing that makes a great Wired science feature is that, crucially, it has to be something that's not super detached, right? There's really interesting innovations that happen in labs all the time, but actually what makes those things super interesting is how they're going to change the life of someone that has some rare genetic illness, or how is it going to change what you have on your dinner plate, or how is it going to change, whatever, how we travel, or how we build our homes, or that type of thing. So I think the best Wired science feature marries up these things where you've got these really dedicated individuals that are doing kind of fascinating things that are changing the world, but they're also going to change it in a way that our readers will feel and that connects with them and impacts. I'd say we don't always get it right? Sometimes not all of those bits are in a feature, and I think you can kind of feel it, but a great feature is something that for me hits those things. It has relevance. It's something that it connects with people's lives, and it's got dedicated people, and it's also, the stakes are large. So I'm always trying to find that sweet spot that is between all of those different things.
Okay, so I mean, I've thrown a couple of very random examples of Matt's work up here, and we'll skip through them in a minute. But the first one up here: prepare yourself for the biggest Apple launch of all time. Exactly the kind of headline you'd expect in Wired. But the twist here is that actually it's a story about an apple called the Cosmic Crisp. And this was a story that I saw and was completely drawn to. I thought it was brilliant, but it was also quite unlikely. With a great intro, apples can be deadly business. So, where did you get the idea for this? Because I feel like you perhaps have a slight niche of picking out particularly random stories within the framework you were talking about.
Yeah, and I did a kind of similar-ish story. So this is a story, right? It's about an Apple launch that, biggest Apple launch ever, happened December the 1st, because really in the US, the Apple industry has been pretty dire. People are a bit bored of, standard red delicious apples. I personally have had a lot of disappointing Apple experiences. So the whole idea is the industry has been working for about over 20 years, actually started in 93, I think, to come up with this super new Apple that was super sweet and exciting, and obviously it used all stuff like gene editing, and it's really interesting how you get to this process of making this through. But I think, to answer your question, Nick, it is basically what I'm trying to do with this is to trick someone into reading a story that is really about agriculture and really about gene editing and is really about how we choose to grow certain types of fruit, because there's this weird thing where what happens is that one apple breed is really, really popular, so everyone makes the same apple, but that's really bad for a lot of ways because crops are susceptible to diseases, and diversity in the crop is actually quite a useful thing. I mean, where I came across this, does anyone listen to the podcast The Illusionist? Helen Zaltzman, literally they mentioned it on this, and I thought, oh, that's awesome, because that's a way into a boring topic, gene editing, really boring, agriculture, quite boring, but it's through something that everyone interacts with, which is apples. So, I'm trying to looking for these ways to talk about things that are fun and really big topics, but to find ways that, connect and cut through.
Okay. So where do you normally get most of your ideas from?
That's a hard question. Often, to be honest, a lot of the time, when you see a news story and the news story is about a thing, and really, I don't know about you, but I'm a really bad reader of news because I read the first 3 paragraphs, skip, read paragraph 7, skip, end. Honestly, a lot of these stories come from when you actually just read them in detail, and you'll see something that is like, oh, there are these people that are working on this thing. So this story I did about gene editing again, bananas, because there's a disease that's going to wipe them all out, and it sucks. Right, yeah, so, again, this is actually about EU regulation, because, EU has some very interesting regulations around bananas. But this was a thing, this was a news story that was talking about a company in Norwich, exotic, that was using CRISPR gene editing to make decaffeinated coffee. But actually, decaf coffee is cool, but it's actually really interesting because the implication of this work is this is the only thing that necessarily could save bananas from destruction, which is actually genuinely happening. So it's those kind of things. You try and find companies that are doing interesting things, or you try and find a thing that happens, and you want to build it out and find a story about this. I did this thing about dinosaurs and how people trade dinosaur skeletons, and it was because a dinosaur skeleton was being sold. But to me, it's like, how do you find something that moves it beyond the news story and tells something that doesn't need that hook? So I wish I had a better answer. I mean, I also read trade publications; they're great. Genuinely, that's a great place to look. But often I'm trying to fill out all that interesting stuff that happens beyond a headline, I guess.
So what's your process? So let's say you get some alarm bells ringing where you find a way into the great banana debate, but you're thinking, how do I kind of put this together? Where do you go from there, and how long does it take to then sort of research a topic before you think you've got enough of a robust story to kind of come up with a sell like that? The banana is dying.
Yeah. So what I generally do is put out a couple of calls. Often what I'm doing, because I'm writing about science, I'm talking to academics, I'm talking to researchers who love to chat, so that's great. I don't tend to have problems with access and things like that, because I'm not doing important reporting a lot of the time that does, you face kind of worse brick walls with that kind of stuff. So, I'll talk to a couple of academics, I'll be like, what's actually kind of going on here? What are the dynamics of this industry? How does it actually work? What are the things that are obvious to you, but are surprising to a reader? And from that, I'll start to build a sort of sense of the shape of the story and finding out there's this kind of interesting thing and this is going on. And then I think at a certain stage, when you're writing a piece that, like this, where it's 4,000 or 5,000 words long, you want to start thinking, well, who are your characters going to be? And I get a sense that there's this amazing researcher in Australia, James Dale, that's really creating bananas that no one else is really making. So that's really interesting. That's one person. There's this amazing lab in Norwich, so that's another thing. and then, well, where does this story start? It started when we found this disease. That's where the story starts, literally. It started when we found this really terrible disease that is killing all the bananas. So who's the person that found that disease? And I think that's kind of my thinking. Once I've sketched out that there's enough going on there, I'm like, great, okay, I could write something. Who am I going to tell this story through? And then it's about trying to find, reach out to them and building all that stuff. So I wouldn't say that I necessarily have the structure in mind at the beginning, but I am thinking, who are the people I can hang this on? Sometimes you need 3 characters, sometimes you don't. There's such a central narrative, there's just one person. But I'm kind of looking for the right people that can really sustain it.
Yeah, I was particularly interested reading your work because it is really narrative. It does read like a proper story with characters and a bit of a plot. And you do seem to start a lot of your intros with a kind of colour, moment in time of a character. Where is there a place where you kind of look to, or earlier in your career you look to kind of get some confidence in doing that? Because it's not necessarily it's not something that a lot of feature writers necessarily gravitate to. Certainly not on science.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are 2 things. One of them is really obvious. Like, read books about the subject you're going to be writing about, because someone would have done more research than you and gone in depth and found these scenes. And I mean, I wouldn't say you could steal that stuff, but I'm saying that there's a lot that's out there already. And I just wrote this thing about SUVs, right? The SUV industry. And actually, it turns out that SUVs are kind of here because there's this big fight over chickens in 1963, and fast forward 20 years and we have SUVs, right? But I found that from a book that written in 2004 about SUVs, and I think that often if you can just take that time to go a little bit more in depth and find that someone that really has dedicated a year to doing that research, it's not too hard to find those color scenes in a more general sense. When it comes to finding the people, often what because like I said, like a lot of the times these are quite boring people that are pipetting stuff or doing stuff in a lab. What I'm always trying to do is be like, don't tell me what you did. Tell me, how did it feel when you got this news? So in this case, like when you look down that microscope and you realize there's this disease that had wiped out all the bananas in the 1950s, what did that feel like? Like, what was that moment? Can you describe that moment? And yeah, sorry, I realize I'm not really answering your question, Nick, because you're asking, like, where did I find the confidence to do that? Honestly, I think it's because, like, the stuff I read, whatever, like David Grand stories about people that walk across the Antarctic or something, that's people that are doing remarkable things. Like, Emma, you write about people in interesting situations doing remarkable things a lot of the time. I'm like, how do you try and... Well, I've got to find a way to make these people remarkable, because a lot of people are remarkable in their everyday lives, and I'm trying to channel a little bit of that, right? Trying to make something feel not extreme, but raise the stakes to try and emulate, I guess, what I'm reading a lot of the time, because I haven't done it yet. I'd love to write a story about someone that, I don't know, is in an amazing life or death situation, but unless you're a banana, like, I'm not. These are, like, so I'm trying to manufacture some of that, I guess, urgency.
And, I mean, is there something, like a common thread that you think other people might be able to recognize in your writing and the way you go about plotting together features?
Yeah, that's interesting. Because it is funny, the more of these type of features you do, the more you feel like, I'm going to whack out that structure. Like, you start to feel the same threads coming through. Yeah, I guess this is not exactly a thread so much as I guess a kind of a technique or a thing that probably comes up in a lot of people's writing and probably do a lot better than I do. But you try and bring the weight of a situation to bear on a particular moment. And so, something like this banana story, it's been happening since, he discovered this virus, fungus, in the 80s. But actually, we've known about this thing for a lot longer, since the 50s or even the 30s. But I think what I try and do, and a thread that comes through, is you try and bring everything to bear on this particular moment and say, actually, it was in August 2018 that the EU passed this legislation, and what did that mean? It meant that the banana was pretty fucked, basically. It meant that we're not going to have the banana savior that we felt it was. So I think that, if anything, often what I'm trying to do is take a really broad scope of a story and try to bring it to bear on a very particular moment, and so that feels like you've got some kind of structure and there's a point, and it's a good way to bring it up to date, because I think otherwise these stories can kind of float, and it could be like, and there's this thing, and maybe it'll be cured, or maybe it won't. I think that I'm often really trying to impose a sense on the narrative and try and find these moments, turning points where things matter and decisions happen that flip things from one way to another way.
Just two final questions. Well, first of all, as just from a kind of anyone that might be looking to kind of pitch ideas into you, what would be your advice for kind of how to sell a story to you? And I suppose that the last one is probably actually we'll save the last one for the very end. We'll come back to it.
So advice for pitching. So probably my number one thing would be, and this is like common, you've probably heard this a million times, but pitch stories, not themes. So rather than, I don't know, rather than, the food crisis is a thing and we're kind of fucked and we're going to run out of food, can you do a piece that's about the people that are searching in the Peruvian Alps, don't know what the mountain range is, Andes, to find the bean that will solve us all, right? It needs, give me like a narrative and not a thematic idea. So, tell me you found that person that's actually doing this work. So I think it's all about giving, having a pitch that, because there's loads of interesting ideas. The food crisis is an interesting topic. Sustainability is interesting. That it's not that it's wrong to think about a story in that vein at all. It's more like, show me that there's this kind of sharp angle and you can bring it to life through this story. That's a really massive thing. If you can find this story, especially someone that I wouldn't have access to, I'm kind of pretty sold, to be honest. The second thing is, just think, what is your headline going to be? Because what I'm doing as a science editor, I'm thinking, that's an interesting story. I buy it, right? 90% of the pitches, I'm like, right ballpark. But I've also got to think, well, how do I get a general audience interested that are just on Facebook or are not even looking for a story about bananas or beans or, SUVs or anything, or dinosaurs? So what headline am I going to write? And usually, quite often, I get pitches that are like, this is an interesting thing, can plants solve the financial crisis? And I think if it has a question mark in it, you've not quite found that way in. And I'm always looking for that way in. And if you haven't found the way in, I can't find it. And so it's usually a no, even though it might be an interesting idea, and usually it is.
That's a very good answer. Brilliant. We'll come back so you can all ask Matt some questions at the end. But now if I could ask Emma a few questions. Christy, do you mind flicking a couple of slides? Brilliant. So Emma, rather like Matt, do you mind giving us a kind of 1 minute sort of highlights reel of kind of how you got to where you are today at the FT?
So this will not apply to any of you now. I applied for a job at the FT through the Guardian media pages, and they were doing a mass recruitment for the new website. And so I joined the website, worked on different sections, media, companies, markets, world, and then moved to print to UK News. And then while I was editing on UK News, I thought I really want to do features. These are the things that I really like doing. The FT didn't have a features writer job at that point. So then I kind of asked to go part-time freelance, and I went part-time freelance and started writing for other magazines and ended up doing stuff for the FT quite a lot. So then I kind of sold them a half job, which was full-time at the FT and half-time feature writing and half-time editing. And then in the end, I persuaded them to give me a features job. So there's only 2 feature writers at the FT, and the second one is quite new. And I mainly focus on work. So I do write for Weekend and Opinion and so on. But there's another features writer that's dedicated to the Weekend. But that's 2 jobs out of hundreds.
That's pretty astonishing, a publication the size of FT, only 2 features writers. I'm assuming that's because the FT makes a point of hiring people who are, generally speaking, good writers, so are pretty versatile and able to kind of jump on everything. Is that?
I mean, I think that's the idea. I think reality is a bit different, and if you've ever edited, you will know that raw copy is very different to the finished copy, and if you are starting off, always study the before and after, and don't think your copy started off the way it ended, because it invariably didn't. And so I think that the FT really values writing a lot more than it used to. And there's some brilliant people that can turn their hand to everything. They can write beautifully, are amazing reporters, but some people can't do everything. And so that's okay, I think.
Yeah, I certainly remember when I first went into journalism, I was surprised to realise that being a good journalist didn't actually require you to necessarily be a good writer, and some very good writers I knew weren't necessarily particularly good at finding great stories.
Yeah.
Whereas the FT, because of things like Lunch with the FT,
Yeah.
you only kind of there's a lot of kind of head turning, really great writing, and especially features. So you do a lot. You do quite a broad range of feature writing styles, and obviously the thing that holds it together is covering the changing nature of work. But you do also seem to do some opinion pieces, and you've got some kind of regular franchise things as well. What do you enjoy most, and what would you say is the kind of hallmark of a kind of Emma Jacobs FT feature? Is there a sort of through line?
No, I don't think so. I think just talking to people, and I think that there's. I was talking to a friend who freelances. I was like, what should I say today? And he was like, he said, which I think is true, is the things that you think are going to be brilliant and fun, like interviewing celebrities, or sometimes they are amazing, and sometimes you get to meet people that you just have brilliant conversations. But often it is about, sometimes the joy is slogging away and, talking to people and just finding some gem in a kind of pile of rubbish. And then other times it's like trying to think of a different structure, or but I think generally the sort of stuff I do is humanizing business, and the FT has traditionally been quite a dry. It's changed quite a lot recently. I think the web has changed it and has made people want to click on things that are more relatable, and I think that's helped humanize stories a bit.
So is there a sort of type of story that you're drawn to? Because we picked out a couple of examples here. So this one was most of us want to try and lead as normal life as possible. So this was about a business leader living with cancer, which is obviously really, working with cancer is obviously a really difficult topic, and not one that necessarily many people would jump on as a where do you get kind of ideas for pieces like this? Because you've also competing with like a large volume of work to go out the door, whereas Matt's doing maybe a kind of monthly, and I might be very wrong about this, Matt, but the cadence is probably a bit slower, and you've got sort of 4,000 word long form things. Emma, yours are a bit more kind of faster paced, presumably, so you've got to come up with quite a large volume of great ideas all the time.
So I always keep a database of ideas. A list. A list of ideas. And also the thing that I always, I've got a mentee who's an editorial assistant at another publication, and she's always complaining that ideas get stolen. And I think that is quite a big complaint among people starting out. And I just think, just have more ideas. Just get on with it. It really doesn't matter. You've got an idea. I've probably got the same idea as you. You just have 10 more of those ideas, and sometimes people are stealing them, but invariably they're not. They're just coming up with the same ideas. So it's the way of telling it. It's the way of writing it. But ideas are just, I think, think kind of widely about the subject, and step away from your computer, get out of the building. That's not always possible. There's a lot of tight deadlines, and in a dream we'd all be going off and doing 4,000 word pieces, every 6 weeks or something, but that's not the reality. So I think just talk to people, just talk to editors, talk to your friends, try and find out the gaps that are interesting, as Matt was saying, and make it relatable to someone.
So, in terms of how you make it relatable to someone, sort of similar, I guess a similar question to what I asked Matt, but how do you do that in a way that fits the kind of the FT audience and the kind of brand and everything else? Is there something that makes a really great FT feature, kind of the hallmarks of it?
It's really hard to say because it's a very broad publication. So we've got weekends. So if I was starting off, I would just study each section and look at the structure and look at the range of topics. There's no one FT feature. There's 1,100 word features, there's 4,000 word features, there's ones in how to spend it, so just study each section and try and discern some sort of common theme. I think that FT readers are not that different to cosmopolitan readers in that they all want to read about things that relate to them, They also find it hard to juggle their families and, manage their money, sort of. So just try and find things that relate to the audience. You don't get it right. The joy of online journalism is that there's a million people telling you've got it wrong. So.
Well, I mean, on that point, personal experience, the FT has fact checkers, doesn't it? And it's quite, it's obviously a paper that takes accuracy extremely seriously. I mean, all papers do, but some more than others. Does that sometimes make things harder, or knowing that it's got everything you do's got to meet a very exacting standard, or do you just have to lift yourself to that?
I think you just have to do that. I'm all up for accuracy.
It's definitely not a bad thing.
Yeah. Just be really thorough and tick off every fact on the proof that you're reading it before it goes out. Because if you're writing anything and people are going to, rip you apart, don't make it easy for them. Just, if you fuck up, then you've let them in already, so don't do it.
Are there any pieces that you've written that you're particularly proud of, or that that you look back on and go, that was a really special piece? That
I think the ones that I have enjoyed have been slightly personal ones, but also I think anything long and it's finished and no one's complained about it is a real achievement. I'm really pleased with it.
I mean, and this might be an inaccurate observation, but I feel like you're willing to put yourself into the story a bit at times as well. There's a few pieces that I read of yours where you were, for instance, the public speaking piece, or there was. What was it? Basically, I read a few where you were kind of putting yourself into the story, and I haven't seen a lot of that
at the FT.
Yeah,
there isn't, and you can't do it too often. Otherwise, someone will tell you to shut up. And I mean, a few people get away with it, the editor, but everybody else, you're not as interesting as you think you are, and it has to be. I think you have to bring something to it. So I wrote about technology and grief on the basis of texting my dead dad, and so that was kind of. It would be a bit weird if I hadn't put that in, and so it was all about grief and how it distorts your thinking, and I've written about having kids because it's a personal subject, but it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to write about these things, especially if you're a woman, because you don't want to look fluffy all the time, or you don't want to mention your kids if people are then going to typecast you.
I mean, do you have a kind of structured approach to how you go about sort of researching and then actually putting pen to paper and writing?
Depends what the deadline is. I've filed a magazine piece which is 4,000 words, and I had a brilliant idea 6 months ago, and then I had to fit the reporting in around the kind of week-to-week grind, and I think you just sort of fritter away, do a bit, and then you try and pretend it's not happening, and then you go back to it, and so it depends on deadlines, really.
I mean, let's say you had a sort of generous deadline and all the everything aligned and it was all great. Would you, is there an element of it you enjoy the most? So, for instance, I know some people already have an introduction in their heads almost before they've even started, researching a feature, and then everything becomes a kind of cut and paste, sort of mentally trying to make it all fit around it. I mean, how do you go about thinking about how you're going to bring it to life?
I try and think what the kind of nut par is, and why I'm telling it now, and I do like writing intros, and if I haven't got it right, then I can't sometimes I'll just carry on writing it, but I really think the intro is the only way to get people to start reading it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's really worth spending a lot of time on it.
Does everyone here sort of know what Emma means by a nut graph or a nut par?
See, at the FT we've been calling it bollocks par, but I think that might change with a female editor.
Maybe you could just give everyone just a quick sense of what you mean by that.
Okay, it's a kind of it brings the story to a kind of, why are you reading it now? This says something about the state of Brexit it lifts it above the kind of granular detail that you probably mentioned in the intro, and explains what the story is going to be, and kind of signposts, not explicitly, but kind of signposts the reader what they're about to read.
So do you, as a discipline, do you write that out before almost before you've written the feature type thing? No.
It would be a good discipline. I mean, that in a way is the pitch.
Yeah.
That if you could come up with a paragraph, that is a good pitch to have.
Okay.
But you'll refine that as you report it.
Brilliant. My last question is before we move on to Martin. If you had 3 sort of tips to kind of give to the audience as if they were kind of looking to write really great business features, what would be, from your kind of experience to date, the 3 kind of lessons you've learned along the way that you'd sort of impart?
I mean, PRs are really hard to navigate, and there are some people that will say, "Oh, I hate PRs." No offense, Nick, but and that's, I think that's the wrong attitude too, because sometimes you get stories from PRs that are, you don't want to be spoon-fed by them, but if you talk to them, something they say at the end of the conversation might be a brilliant idea, but generally negotiating with PRs is something that is hard to do, and you need to build relationships, but you need to make sure that people it's very difficult talking to people about their employer with the PR in the room. It's very difficult to talk to people about their employer full stop, because nobody wants to give an unvarnished quote with their name on it, because that is the end of their job, really. So I think that is the hardest thing, is trying to find employees that will talk about it, and actually the unions aren't that helpful either. So it's a bit of a slog finding employees to talk to about their employer.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. So we can ask Emma some questions shortly, but last but not least, Martin Fletcher. So Martin, obviously you've had a very varied career. You've done a lot of amazing things. Martin used to be the foreign correspondent at the Times, and he's covered nearly every topic imaginable. But could you again try and condense your career into a sort of minute highlights reel for everyone?
So when I left university, I had nothing to do, so I wrote a guide to greasy spoon cafes in London, which involved cycling around London for 3 months and eating 3 lunches a day. And that got me a job on a local paper in North Hertfordshire, which doesn't exist anymore, as most of them don't. And from there I went to the gossip column on the Telegraph for a year, and then I switched to the Times, where I spent longer than most of you have been alive, I should think. Next 30 years. Whereupon my daughter had joined by that stage, and she rose through the ranks and became night editor. And she was telling me what to do and spiking my stories. So I thought, this is time to go. We had so at that point I became freelance, which was in 2013, 6 years ago.
So, obviously, you've got a slightly different story to Matt and Emma in terms of what you cover, and we've pulled together a couple of examples here on slides which we'll flick through. But this story particularly stood out to me because it was a story about it's called Return to Haiti, and you can read up here. Really, a story of how Martin went back and took a girl called Marie back to Haiti, and it's a pretty touching story, very moving, and even the last line was a bit of a tearjerker. But for me, it kind of summed up the fact that you're what you do involves you being in the story, a lot of the time, because you're often sort of writing reportage or sort of mediating your own experiences of a place. I'm really interested to kind of find out how you do that, really, and how difficult that is, especially with this story.
This was probably the most distressing story I covered. So I did the Haiti earthquake, and I wrote this. The Times magazine wanted a story about the victims, the child victims, and I found Marie in a hospital, and this is a few weeks after the earthquake, and she'd lost a leg, and she'd lost her home, and she'd lost everything else, and I wrote a story about her, and the last paragraph said, Marie would like to be a doctor when she grows up, so she can help others like others have helped her, but it would take a miracle because she's disabled in a country where the disabled are stigmatized, and she's lost everything. And about 2 weeks after I got back, I got an email from the principal of a school in Cambridge saying, we were very moved by your story. We would like to offer Marie her entire secondary education. She was about 11 at the time. And I thought long and hard about this, because we would be plucking this girl who came from a dirt poor family. I mean, they had nothing. Plucking her out of everything she was familiar with, and one day she would have to go back. But I thought I couldn't play God. It wasn't for me not to pass the offer on, so we passed the offer on, and of course they leapt at it, and we spent 6 months trying to get her passports and visas and everything else, and we eventually got her to Britain. She spent 5 years in Cambridge, and she was wonderful. She was a terrific girl. We all adored her, but she couldn't pass exams. I think when she was young, she suffered from malnutrition, and that causes some sort of cognitive problems. And because she couldn't pass exams, she couldn't go on to higher education, so we couldn't get her visa extended. So we had to take her back, and we took her back. She was, by that stage, totally westernized, you know, the iPods and, you know, all the latest music and everything. And we had to leave her in this village where there was no running water. She had all these electrical gadgets, and there was no electricity to charge them with. It was heartbreaking. I can't remember what the question was.
I think the question was really sort of how you go about sort of mentally preparing yourself to do something like that, because you had to give a lot of yourself and your own story to kind of tell this one, and you seem willing to put yourself out there, you know, in a lot of the pieces you write.
Well, I did a lot of wars, and wars are really about ordinary people caught up in extraordinary situations, you know, by forces greater than themselves. So invariably you become emotionally involved in them. You can't not. I mean, there was another young girl in Zimbabwe. It wasn't a war, but it was at the height of hyperinflation. So hyperinflation was I don't know, trillion%. It was something incredible. And Mugabe had destroyed all the slums. And I went to one of the slums to write about how it was affecting people, and I hadn't got a visa to be there. I wasn't allowed to be there, so they had to bring everyone to a church to meet me. And there were young men who had turned to thieving to survive, and young women had turned to prostitution, and the last person was a mother with this young girl, and she had a woolen hat on her head, pulled right down. And she was the last person I talked to, and the mother came up and she pulled the hat off, and this girl had lesions all, and it was made me recoil to look at. It was a horrible sight, all over her head, and her eyes were closed, sort of gummed shut. And we turned her into, we ran a story saying this is the face of Mugabe's Zimbabwe, because her parents had lost their jobs, they'd lost their house, they had no money, they couldn't afford medicines. And Times, I was on the Times at that point, they gave thousands of pounds, and we sent it off to some Jesuit priests we knew in Zimbabwe and said, look after this girl. And the next time I went back, we found her in a hospital which all the doctors and the nurses had left because they weren't being paid, and she was sitting by herself in this dirty side room. And it was just appalling, and we literally walked her out of the hospital. I thought I'd do this. And I was actually staying with the doctor. We took her to where I was staying, and we went to the OD pediatrician left, and he put her into a private nursing home. And again, a girl from the slums. And that's where she spent the last few weeks of her life, but it was too late to save her. And, so she died.
Gosh, so I mean, with stories like that, and stories that are, because you also write that Martin writes a lot of sort of more light-hearted stories as well, just to level this out. What are the kind of rules that you've kind of picked up over the years for successfully writing colour reportage type pieces, where you're using the first person without tipping into a place where it becomes about you? How do you do that, sort of walk that line successfully?
I'm not sure you're allowed to ask me questions I don't know the answer to. Look, it's a bit of a trend in British journalism to inject yourself into the story. It's what editors want. I don't know if it's what readers want. But sometimes it's an advantage, not always. You can overdo it, as Emma said, but sometimes it allows you to describe more vividly the places you're in or the people you're interacting with, or I think it's something you use occasionally, not too much.
Okay, Christy, could you just skip one slide? So yes, I was fascinated by this Inside Wimbledon piece, because it's not a story that I would have necessarily ever read, because I look at Wimbledon and think it's preposterous. Can't even say it. I think it's mad. But this was, I thought, a piece of genius, because it sort of took all of the fussiness and all of the detail that a lot of people will think makes Wimbledon a fantastic institution, and sort of told it through pure colour all the way through. And I'll send round to everyone who's got a ticket links to all of our speakers' features afterwards, so you can look at what we're talking about in a bit more depth and see some of the techniques they're talking about in action. But I pulled out a couple of quotes here and a few things you can read on the screen. But it was actually a pretty extraordinary story, like the anal insanity at work in Wimbledon behind the scenes. How did that come about, and where do you come up with ideas like that I'm going to go behind the scenes at Wimbledon and sort of see how it all comes together?
Well, I think it's a question a lot of people will ask themselves if they go to Wimbledon. I like tennis. How do they stage it? I'm in the privileged position where I can ask myself, how do they stage an event like this, and then go and find out the answers. So I just called up the people at Wimbledon, said, can I come along and spend 2 or 3 days? And it was terrific. Who knew that they use 57,000 tennis balls in the course of 2 weeks? Or they eat 28 tons of strawberries? Or that there's a team of, I think it was 12 people who do nothing but string rackets, and they use 30 miles of gut during the 2 weeks. So and they have their own hawk called Rufus, whose job is to scare all the pigeons off the court.
all important detail. But I mean, what you're obviously drawn to kind of little details and little moments and things like that. I feel like, how do you go into an encounter and have a kind of conversation like we're having now at the same? I feel like you must be able to split your brain in two and somehow have a conversation with someone, but then at the same time analyze, observe, and pick out all the nuances and all the colour. How do you go about doing that?
Everyone's got a story in them. It's a way of life. I mean, I'm sure Emma and Matt feel the same as I do. You this evening, I'm looking out for stories. The rise of Poplar. Well, there could be a story in that. There's a story in everything. I think when you're interviewing people, what they're saying is half the story, but how they say it and the circumstances of the interview are just as much of the story. How did they arrive? What are they wearing? What's their body language? Best time. So number one tip, when you're recording an interview, don't turn off the recorder after the formal interview ends, because that's when their guard goes down and they start talking about themselves or more personal stuff, or they stop talking the official line if it's a politician and say what they really think.
Well, on that note, Christy, could you skip one slide for us? So this one, your interview with Michael Bloomberg. I thought this was interesting because obviously...
Prescient.
Yes. Well, the question of whether he'd run for president was in the headline, and you're reading throughout the whole thing, and how you prize it out is that we've got the last paragraph down in the bottom there, but how you pull it out of him and press him for it ends up being sort of part of the story. So how did you get him to kind of actually sort of say that? I think the quote was here, he's not ruled out a battle of the billionaires next time round and the chance to become America's first Jewish president. If God came and said, would you like the job? I would think it's a wonderful opportunity to change the world. I mean, that's about as close as you're going to get to, so how did you get there?
Well, Bloomberg's been running for president or about to run for president for about 20 years. He's a sort of inveterate hinter at running for president. So that wasn't very hard. But to go back to my previous point, I mean, what was interesting about Bloomberg was not what he said, but again, he chose to do the interview in the middle, at his desk in the new Bloomberg headquarters in central London. He doesn't have this is the 8th, 10th richest man in America, and he sat in the middle of this open plan office, and all his employees call him Mike, not Mr. Bloomberg or anything like that. I mean, I thought that speaks volumes about the guy.
Absolutely. It was great colour.
Tip number two, never ever let people interview people in hotels or really bland places. If you possibly can, interview them in their homes or in their offices or somewhere personal, because I went to interview Nigel Owens, the World Cup rugby referee, and insisted on doing it in his home. This is just after the World Cup. And the first thing I saw as I walked up his drive was his car, and the number plate was NIG Ref. And his house is full of all these old rugby shirts and cups and shields and signed photographs from players. I mean, there several sentences just in those sort of bits of colour, those little details.
So what do you do where you can't mediate the environment, and especially Emma touched on it briefly, but a situation where, for instance, it's a controlled situation where maybe there's a PR in the room or there's some representatives, and there's a sort of an element of someone on their guard, not wanting to kind of talk about their family or their part. How do you get past that?
A friend of mine is called Stephen Sacker, and he does Hard Talk. And the Radio Times called me and said, would you go and interview Stephen Sacker on the 20th anniversary of Hard Talk? He's an old friend. I've known him for years. We were in Washington and Brussels together. And we went there, and there was this PR woman sitting between us to mediate. And it was absurd. I can't stand them. If I can possibly find a way of doing the interview without one, I will. I will protest long and hard. But you don't always win. But I don't. The worst ones are the Hollywood stars who, you've got an hour and it's in a hotel and you've got PRs and you aren't allowed to ask these questions. I don't do these,
Yeah.
but Janice Turner on the Times who does, and she always writes in the piece, I wasn't allowed to ask about this, or I wasn't allowed to ask about that. That again, it becomes part of the story. Very often when you call someone and ask for an interview, especially if it's a politician, they'll say no, or they'll say on these conditions or whatever. And that, this is all material. It's all stuff you can use. It's all material that tells you something about them, whether they're a prima donna or a regular person. Or I did James Comey, the FBI director, just after he'd been sacked by Trump. Half of America loathe this guy, but he arrives by himself in an SUV. No airs and graces at all. I thought says a lot about him.
We can bring SUVs back to chickens and James Comey. Yeah, that's great. Fantastic. Well, look, last question for me before we put it to the panel. But what is your kind of process? Because obviously a lot of your pieces are quite colour driven. There's a lot of craft in your writing. So what's the kind of split between research and experience versus actually putting pen to paper and shaping it? And do you have a kind of similar question I asked these guys? Do you have a kind of, I guess, a hallmark of a Martin Fletcher feature?
No, it's all a bit of a mystery, actually. Someone commissions a piece, or I go and get an idea commissioned, and I'm filled with dismay, something close to panic, actually. I think, how on earth am I going to deliver this piece? So I spend, a bit like Emma, a couple of days preparing, reading, working out who I'm going to interview, all that, and then you go off to wherever it is, and you think you've mastered the story, and of course, the more you talk to people, the more the story spins out of control, and it becomes much more complicated. It's never black and white. It's always multiple shades of grey. Then you come back to write it, and you've got all this information in your head, and you think, how on earth am I going to make a coherent feature out of this? It's like putting a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle together. But somehow the act of sitting down and writing sort of organizes your thoughts, and eventually it gets done. But as I say, it's a mystery. God knows how.
Superb. Well, would anyone here like to try and unlock some of the mysteries? We've got any questions? We've got a microphone that we can pass around. Otherwise, I will try and pass my microphone around. Tell you what, could you possibly come forward, and I don't think we can stretch, and ask a question? That'd be great. Just didn't say who you are.
I'm Tom. I'm a reporter for Yahoo. Thanks very much for that. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting. I wondered, you've kind of touched on it there, once you've got your material, and aside from the intro, how do you tend to kind of work out your structure, plan the structure of the piece, and do you have any tips on structure? And then secondly, Nick's been too modest to talk about his journalism background. What makes a good feature for Inside Housing, which is where I think you used to work? Thanks very much.
Maybe you could kick off.
Shall I go for it? I would say structure is the main thing. Like, I think you touched on it there by asking, what you do after you got that structure. But I would say almost to bring it back an element. Martin, what you're saying is, so you come home from reporting, you've got all these transcripts, you've got all these facts, you've got all these scenes, and you're like, well, how do I, corral that into a piece? I'd say the main thing that I'm thinking is, what is the structure to that? Can I fit it, if it's a 4,000 word piece, into 4 sections? And how do I, so I've got this great conversation from someone and this great scene. How can I find a place for that? And then this becomes the bit about this person that's digging up the dinosaurs, and then this can all go in the bit about the people that sell the dinosaurs. And I think I'm trying to, in a way, if I was doing it with a highlighter, I'd be labeling all this information and being like, that all goes in that bit. And honestly, once I've done that bit, I'm then like, okay, so I've got my kind of 4 themes. What are these scenes or the memorable bits that are going to stick into each one of those? And, I try and kind of get that out. And then I would say, once you've done that hard work, it's not that the writing is easy, and I think it's probably different for everyone, but I'd say that when I'm finding it really difficult, it's almost always a problem with structure. And if I go back to that thing, have the components, that's what leads me to it. I mean, the writing is not pretty the first time. It's not any good, but you kind of get through it as long as I've got the bones to hang it on. So it's all, for me, 70% of the work is
taking the reporting out of it, 70% of the work is the structure and making sure I get that right and I know where everything goes.
I think the structure depends on where it is in which paper or magazine or the length. I think when you start off, I find structure very hard on 4,000 word pieces. I think when you start off, copy structures from the publication and just look and just break it down. How many paragraphs did it take to get to the nut par? Does the history, where's the history go? And I suppose for longer pieces, you would think about, how is this going to be told in pictures? So which characters do I need to bring out? In what settings? And also, I think once you've done the first draft, however ugly it is, I think that you really need to stand back and think, what am I saying? What do I want somebody to, which isn't the same as being biased, but it's the same. It's not just getting a range of opinions, because that's sort of meaningless. It's like a blancmange, and so I think just sort of, let it rest if you can, if time allows it. Let it rest overnight, and then look at it, and think. And then sort of really forensically go through everything and think how redundant this is or how awful it is. But I always come up with subheads anyway, just generally. Think about subheads, what they might be. Unless you're a sub, you might not come up with good ones yourself, but try and think what markers they might be.
I totally agree. You've got to think of it as 3 or 4 different blocks rather than one long narrative. I always try and start with some really vivid scene, something that gives you a sense of place or a sense of person, and I always try to end with a sort of kicker at the end, which is a little unexpected. And then if your opening scene's good enough, you've bought yourself a bit of time. This is all about keeping the reader reading. So maybe after your first section, you can go into a bit of background, then you go back into the more topical stuff. It's not like it's difficult. It's really hard. It's not like news stories are easy. You just get the intro and everything else follows. But this is, as I said, it's like putting a 1,000-word jigsaw together. If I get stuck, I go to bed. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, it suddenly comes to me in a flash of lightning, a eureka moment. And then I get up at 5, and then I have to get up and write it down so I don't forget. Then the next day it sort of works itself up. But the other point Matt made is just get something down. Even if it's bad, it allows you to see where you've gone wrong. It gives you and it allows you to see what material you have and how you can better order it. So actually, discipline is half the answer, just writing.
Very quickly, I think the features that I love, the features that I respect the most, are the ones that seem to capture that sort of moment in time. So they seem to be the kind of the voice that encapsulates everything. But I'm also personally really drawn to stories that other people just wouldn't think to tell. So either because they're too obscure or because they appear to be too boring. I like small details that can be flipped and played with, and suddenly they become critical things and they're hiding in plain sight. And I guess this is probably why I'm now in marketing, but I'm attracted to like the conceit, I guess. And obviously really human stories, experiences as well. So that kind of the voices that don't normally get a kind of platform. And I think particularly in the science world, that's why I'm very interested in what you're doing, Matt, where you're speaking to scientists who aren't normally let out of their labs ever, so they don't have a first idea about what they think is interesting about a story is so many miles away from what your average reader would think. And same with, to some extent, with Emma, because you're picking out work stories where you're kind of making heroes of everyday situations. And I see a lot of big narratives about the changing face of work and all this stuff, and they're normally expressed in reports and things like that. So when you turn to the FT and you see stories about apps where, you know, actually someone experiencing what it's like to do co-office space within your home, or you know, things like that. It just, that humanizing of it, I really love. I really love that. So yeah, that's just me. You had your hand up just then, yes.
Yeah, hi. My name is Gustav. I study a master's in journalism at City. I was just wondering if you ever had to drop a features that you really wanted to write because of any sort of reasons, and maybe also touching on to that, if you still have a feature within you that's still burning to get out, but that you haven't really had the chance to follow up on yet.
I mean,
No.
yeah, go on. I think, I mean, stories that, yeah, there are stories that I've tried to do, and then, you know, and then someone else does it, and that really pisses you off, and then, or you could just kind of lose your way in the reporting, and you can't kind of, I don't know. I did this last year with, I wanted to do something on why boys want to call. Couldn't see what was going on and just slightly abandoned it, and then because I'd spoken to the magazine, they were quite keen on it. They gave it to, I mean, you know, they're you know, I have a good relationship with them, so it's not bad, but they gave it to Simon Cooper, and then I started thinking, who's a sports writer and feature writer, and I just felt really pissed off that I let it go, and so I kind of joined his, I sort of hooked myself onto its coattails. But I think just write it down. I think you don't always get the story right, and you sometimes leave it, and sometimes it's been in your head for years. I mean, and but sometimes you do lose confidence with what it is you're trying to say. I think just persevere, really, but also give up. If it's not working, give. I mean, that's completely contradictory. If it's really not working, then don't kill yourself over it. I mean, if it's there's moments. Sometimes better hooks come up. Sometimes you have a conversation with someone else, and you just suddenly there's this whole reservoir of people that are doing this thing that you want to describe. I think that, yeah, don't kind of. I just think there's a lot of things you can kind of agonize over it, and like you can have a bad stream of work, and then you're really thinking yourself out of how to make it better, and then something changes, like, I don't know, the bus goes on diversion or something like that, and everything's changed, and you can't always control everything.
No, to be honest, I completely agree. I'd also say sometimes people say a thing, or something comes up in these pitch meetings we have every Tuesday morning in the office, and I'm like, I'm working on a feature about that. And then I remember, oh no, I just had an idea, and I thought I was going to do a feature about that. But you never really, I don't know if you find this the same, but there's all these ideas that I think I'm writing a feature on, but I'm really not. I've just spoke to one person about a thing, and I'll pick it up later on. But I'd say, but then sometimes, it's been the case that I have picked it up later on, and I have written a thing on that. So I'd say a lot of times, the good thing about features is that sometimes a great hook comes along, but sometimes if it's a story that's really worth telling, sometimes it can wait and there will be a different reason. I mean, and this is probably, my personality, but I'm always kind of unwilling to think that a feature is ever really dead. It's just not told in the right way. But I think probably we're all a bit arrogant about our own ideas in that respect. Apart from one thing I was trying to work on, remember this measles epidemic that was, the beginning of the summer? And PHE was Public Health England was so difficult to work with. I wanted to talk about the people and how you respond to it and all that stuff. And they always kept frustrating it. But then I think, actually, if I tried a bit harder, I could have, doorstepped the schools and tried. But there's lots of reasons to give up. And it actually comes down to how much you want to do that thing, to be honest. So, yeah, unless your editor does kill it, in which case maybe it's dead.
This doesn't quite answer your question, but I will tell you about my biggest disappointment in my journalistic career, which was 2009. I was in Iran covering the election, and it was stolen. And the day after it was stolen, we all got chucked out, and huge riots erupted on the streets of Tehran. And a young woman called Naida Sultan got shot, and a video of her dying on the streets went round the world. The blood was trickling out, and the regime said she had been shot by the rioters, and the rioters said she had been shot by the regime, and she became the face of the protests. And when I arrived back in London, my phone went, and it was someone telling me that the doctor who treated her, who was the only person who could testify who had really shot her, had fled to London. And the person who called me said, the only thing I know about him is he's a friend of Paulo Coelho, the Brazilian novelist, and something else. And I said to my daughter, who'd just joined the Times, how on earth are we going to find this guy? And she said, don't worry, Dad, I'll leave it to me. And she was a sort of social media type, which I wasn't. And she found him very quickly. And we spent all day trying to persuade him to talk to us, because he still had family in Tehran, and there were going to be recriminations if he appeared on the front of the Times. And finally, about 6 o'clock in the evening, he agreed to talk to us. And he gave us an interview, and we wrote it up. We did 2 pages inside, and we did the front page splash on the Times. And the last thing we had to decide was what the byline was going to be. By Martin Fletcher and Hannah Fletcher, by Hannah Fletcher and Martin Fletcher, by Hannah and Martin Fletcher. Because this was the first time in the 220-year history of the Times that there'd ever been a father-daughter byline. So we pressed the button, filed the story, went back really excited. This is history making. And about 10 o'clock at night, she called me. She said, guess what? And I said, what? She said, Michael Jackson's died. And I said, well, don't worry, they won't budge our story for that. Of course, they tore up the whole paper, and our story appeared about that size on page 13. So that doesn't quite answer your question. That's a great story.
Questions? And then you afterwards. If we do 2 questions at one time, is that all right? We'll throw them specifically.
Mine is a very short. Does it work? Mine is a very short question. I'm Manu. I work for Property Week magazine. Going back to the editing side, how much your pieces are edited, and does it change from editor to editor? I'm talking especially from a freelance perspective. Does it change with time? Does it get less edited, or does it get to the point where you think, oh, this is going to go through, and they're not going to change a comma, and then actually the editor might decide to change more about it? All of them, I guess.
Just keen to get through one or two more before we wrap up. So if you can make one person, that would be fantastic.
I don't know.
Martin's probably been edited by both people.
Yeah, you guys edit other people's work, so maybe Martin again. Yeah.
They wouldn't dare. No, I mean, it varies from publication to publication, but, editors are good on the whole. They're constructive. 2 brains are better than 1. You're foolish to ignore what they say, or always to protest if you're edited. I mean, I was an editor myself, and I like to think it's a very constructive. It can be a very. Actually, there are some really annoying editors, and there's some really good ones, and you distinguish between the 2. If you're writing magazine articles, you get edited less, I think, than if it's a news story. News stories, you have no control at all. If it's a magazine article, they'll give you the PDF before it appears in the magazine. You can go through and check or complain or whatever. News stories, you have very little control. I mean, it just drove me to distraction doing news stories. You never knew quite what was going to appear under your name each day.
You shout for us, that would be great.
Hi, I'm a student at City, and I had a question about, basically, I guess a lot of us here will probably end up working for online publications, and some of those publications are under a lot of pressure to get clicks and create content that will go viral or whatever, and so I guess that gives reporters less time to work on reported features, and I was wondering if you had any advice on anyone who has a job like that where they have a lot of pressure to produce a lot of digital content and not as much time and resources to do reporting.
That sounds like you, Emma.
I mean, I know that a lot of people are under a lot of pressure. I mean, the FT is reasonably pressured, but I know that a lot of people are under a lot worse, where you can't see anybody, you don't go out for any conversations. The most you're allowed is like a 5-minute chat at your desk with a PR. So I think that that in this day and age, you're lucky to have a job, and so I don't think I always think that you have to satisfy your employer and not get too precious about it, and then have a side project that you're doing that will prove yourself. It doesn't mean kind of kill yourself for no money at all, but you know, if that isn't satisfying you, doing short, rapid news stories, then you need to have a kind of side project that you. And actually, in that, having done that, it's not a terrible thing because you get different perspectives, you get a longer timeline. It is difficult if you're spending your weekends doing that, but it's a way of kind of proving yourself. So, I mean, I'm not somebody that thinks that you should be working for free. So, ideally, you should be pitching it for money. But I think that with tight constraints, the idea of leaving college and saying I'm going to be a feature writer from age 22 is quite difficult. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't get there, but I think that you might have to sort of carve it up in different ways. I don't know if that's despair making or.
Yes.
If you have time, earlier my colleague and I were talking about subs and how subs have been cut and how difficult it is to self-edit. You're working for great publications, but have you been affected by that? You were talking about fact-checking and being thorough. Are there other ways that you can mitigate the kind of changing framework and being counting of big organizations?
I think try and do as much fact-checking as you can yourself, but yeah. I mean, it's difficult. Subs are brilliant, so it's really hard to.
And your organisation must have populated with good, healthy subbing teams.
My daughter runs the subs team at the Times, and she has to fight a constant battle to maintain it and constantly make a case for them, which she does.
Condé Nast, is it shared resource or is it just wired? You have your own subs or is it just
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's not as much subbing. It's interesting because New Scientist, great subbing team, very tightly subbed, and Martin, like you were saying, you would submit, I write news there, I was a technology reporter, you'd submit a story, and then you'd be like, that sounds like a New Scientist story, but I don't think I wrote that one, but they do a great job of putting it in the voice. Whereas at Condé Nast, that a lot of that responsibility is, kind of editors and that type of thing. So, I think it's like you were saying, to be honest. You need to. It's really helpful to circle all the facts and be like, am I getting this right? Is my sourcing up to scratch on this? Am I being honest? It's really basic. But when you're filing something to an editor, if you're filing Google Docs or whatever, make sure everything that's a fact is linked and sourced, just so when they do need to do that paper trail, they can find it and they can figure it out. So I'd say that. There probably is a lot that is on the writer to do now, but actually that's a good thing because you can find those things out and, you can fill out all that aspect for yourself. I feel that, you can kind of make it work, but it is a shame because subs do brilliant work and they take they do a lot of the heavy lifting, to be honest. But in reality, sometimes that's just something that, you have to kind of absorb as part of the writing process.
Brilliant. I think we might have to make this the last question, I'm afraid, because we've overrun. So you two together, shout both your questions, and we'll go.
I'm Manas. I work as an investigative journalist back in India. I'm studying with Citi right now, doing my financial journalism. My question is, a lot of time features entail interviewing bigwigs in the industry, and it's very easy to get get awestruck. And it's very difficult. I mean, sometimes when you read articles, they just end up being PR pieces. I'm sure you're well established in your field, but when you're starting out, is it how do you manage that power dynamic?
The very first celebrity I interviewed was Jimmy Savile. And I was totally awestruck. And I didn't ask him if he was a sex offender. And I did write a grovelling piece. I think it's just something that comes with age. Try and imagine them in the nude or on the loo or something. Yeah, they're just human beings. But I think businessmen are really interesting. We all focus on politicians, but it's businessmen who make the world go round. Ask them offbeat questions about, not about the business, about what are they reading, where have they just come from. Ask them about their families, sort of humanize, this is what Emma does, humanize them. And also, remember how powerful you are. You're the one who decides what gets written about them, not them.
I think it's really hard if you've got a beat and you depend on, if you do a profile of a CEO, it's very hard to then slag them off in a interview and then hope that you're going to get their contacts, later. So I think if you can be removed from beat reporting when you do it, but having said that, there's brilliant profiles by beat reporters, and I think just think, what would you really upset yourself if you didn't ask? I mean, I think fear is a good motivator, and also don't always believe what the PRs will tell you that they won't answer, because I remember interviewing Lawrence Graff, who was a Diamond person, and he'd had a illegitimate child, and it was a bit hello for the FT, and but I thought, well, it's the most recent thing that's happened. The PR said, don't ask him, he can't talk about it, he'll close it off. Then at the end I asked him, and he was like really keen to talk about it, and actually it did have an impact on his business because his kids were the succession plan. So I think just ask the question that your mum might want to know. I mean, your dad, whatever, someone who's not in that field.
Did you have a last question as well?
Yes, this probably applies mostly to Matt. So I write about technology and media and telecoms. So often what I write about involves not day-to-day topics, but they can be fairly complex. And one thing I've been trying to improve is how to kind of integrate facts and integrate explanations of these potentially complex topics into paragraphs without them sort of standing out as these lone sentences full of technical jargon. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, that is such a good question, and if you work out a good way of doing it, let me know, because it is really difficult when you're writing about things that are technical and require defining, or you want to drop some facts, to not just have a paragraph of facts. I think what I would be looking to do, and what I try and do, is think about, well, how can I contextualize that fact and situate it in how we got here? So, whatever, if I want to say that there's 70,000 kilometers of internet cabling around the world, can I situate it in the fact that it was a battle between these two cabling companies, to whatever, control the market, and sketch that out in a little bit, and that's how we end up in that way? I mean, some facts are just amazing and they stand on their own, so you can kind of drop them in that way. But I think what I'm trying to do is to try and contextualize them. So when you see a fact that is amazing, or is interesting in some way, you're also providing the narrative of how you got there, and what implication that that is. So I think that you always want to be kind of couching it and contextualizing, because actually in that way you bring the fact to life, if you know what I mean. You've given it a reason to be there, and I think that a lot of the time that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think that was an excellent final answer. Brilliant. Well, look, it just remains to say a huge thank you to our speakers for giving up their time and coming along tonight to speak to everyone. We'll give them all a big round of applause.